Welcome to this podcast, My Positive Birth, a little corner of the internet where I will be collecting positive stories from women birthing their babies across the UK. My name is Lisa. I'm a doula in southwest London. I have 3 children and 2 positive birth stories. I truly believe that we can all learn so much by listening to the positive stories of women and families who have gone before us. What their birth experience was like, what they did, how they felt, how they feel now, a few months or even years later. So come and surround yourself with positive birth stories, told in women's own words. And I hope you'll find a village here to calm you, but also to inspire you and give you confidence in birth. All women and babies deserve a positive birth experience. So let's get cracking on today's episode. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast this week. And I am always excited and honoured to speak to every single mum on the podcast. But today I just times that by a million because I'm joined by Megan. Hi, Megan.
Hi. Oh, that's nice. Thank you.
Megan will tell you herself in a minute, but Megan runs an organisation called BirthEd, which I'm a big fan of, and wish had been around when I had my children. Megan, do you please tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name's Megan Rossiter. I am a mum to 2 boys, and I am the founder of an organisation called BirthEd. I founded BirthEd after the birth of my first baby, which is actually the story that I'm going to be sharing with everybody today. Hopefully it was a way of filling what I felt was a kind of huge gap in birth preparation. It seemed to me that there was a kind of the hypnobirthing preparation that was available was very idealistic, very much put kind of natural home birth on a pedestal, and everything else felt a little bit kind of lesser than. And the kind of other antenatal preparation in terms of antenatal classes was either pretty unrealistic and not a very good preparation for what the maternity system actually entailed, or was essentially kind of grooming women to comply with whatever they were told to do by their care providers. And I felt that there was definitely somewhere in the middle that needed to be sorted, that actually empowered women to feel confident in themselves, to understand the choices and decisions that they were able to make for themselves, but that was kind of judgment free in terms of what those decisions actually ended up being. So very much kind of supporting normal physiological birth and the huge rewards and benefits that has, but in whatever context feels right for them. So whether that was an induction of labour, a cesarean birth, how can we kind of replicate those for those situations? So that is kind of where I developed the BirthEd course from.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. And you do all sorts of stuff online, don't you? And then you run face-to-face courses as well.
Yes, so we've got an online course that is kind of paid for £40 or $49, depending on where in the world you're accessing it. But tons of free information as well. We've got a sort of a different podcast, a kind of information sharing podcast, interviewing experts around all aspects of kind of women's health, parenting, pregnancy and birth. Instagram page that we kind of share loads of free information, mailing list, loads of free information. And then in-person courses I run either over Zoom, but primarily kind of in person in southwest London and Surrey at the moment.
Yeah, brilliant. And I'll put, if you're not following Megan already, then I'll put all her details in the show notes. So you absolutely can. And we've picked a good day to record this, Megan, because it is your son's actual birthday.
We have. We were delayed last week. My computer broke, helpful. And so we've ended up, it is my son's 6th birthday today. So you're getting like a real time reminisce of what literally happened on this day 6 years ago. So it's quite a special day for me today.
And as much as possible, I will hand the floor over to you now. So if you're happy just to take us through whatever you think is relevant really through from the pregnancy through to the birth, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you said sort of starting with the pregnancy, because I think sometimes what happens when we hear birth stories in isolation, sort of from the moment somebody went into labour till the moment baby's born, is we lose any kind of contextualisation of where did this start? What was that pregnancy like? What were you doing before you fell pregnant? What kind of personality have you got? And all of those things are really huge, I think, drivers to how I ended up experiencing this birth. So I suppose the place to kind of start is that when I fell pregnant, I was midway through my midwifery training. So I was going into my second year. And so I had worked in hospital environments, birth centre environments, community, meeting women when they were pregnant. And so had a good idea of kind of what birth looked like, what I wanted from birth, what I didn't want from birth, where the kind of potential stumbling blocks were. So, I thought I had a pretty good idea of what that looked like, what my choices were, what was available to me. Then when I fell pregnant, I suffered with severe hyperemesis gravidarum, or HG, which is basically the very, very extreme end of nausea and vomiting in pregnancy. So I spent a lot of the first 23 weeks of pregnancy in and out of hospital. I was on a lot of medication up until the birth. It obviously kind of impacted both physically and emotionally, lost a lot of weight, was very, very kind of poorly throughout pregnancy. Which again, I feel is kind of relevant to some of the decisions that we ended up making and the kind of the experience that we had of the birth kind of on the day. When we were, it must have been about 20 weeks pregnant, a friend of mine had trained as a hypnobirthing teacher. And so 6 years ago, where are we now, 2022? 6 years ago, hypnobirthing was even less known, less spoken about than it is now. Even in the past 6 years, we've seen it, like the popularity of it bloom, the kind of offering of courses and things, the utilization of it from women has really, really kind of blown up versus 6 years ago when I was pregnant with Otis. And so when she sort of suggested doing a hypnobirthing course, I was somewhat skeptical about what this actually kind of might involve. But we were supposed to be having renovations done on our house, and she was supposed to be going away for a long period of time. And she basically told us that we could stay in her house for free. So me and my husband were like, well, we can't not do it. We have to pay her for this course because she's giving us our house for free. So we were sort of like obliged into attending this hypnobirthing course, which in the strangest turn of events basically ended up transforming my entire life. So one of those like weird sliding door moments. We did this like one-to-one hypnobirthing course in our house. And bearing in mind that I actually kind of worked in the maternity system, I'd seen lots of women give birth, it really, really opened my eyes and transformed what I thought birth was, what I thought I was capable of, and really, really changed our plans and our preferences for our birth. So I had initially been thinking that I was going to give birth on a birth centre because they were nice, they were relaxing. But when I really kind of got to grips with actually how your mind works in labour, the prospect of getting in a car in labour just seemed totally mad to me. And the idea of actually being in my home environment just made so much more sense. My husband hates hospitals, so I knew that he wouldn't be comfortable in the kind of hospital environment. And so actually, different to what a lot of people experience, but he was kind of quite on board with this right from the beginning. We ended up deciding to plan a home birth. So this was our kind of plan. From about 24 weeks, we decided that we were going to have a baby at home. So our local trust where I gave birth have got a really, really fantastic home birth team. All of the antenatal appointments switched to being from our home. The kind of conversations that we were having with midwives, the length of the appointments, it all just like vastly improved when we made that decision to switch to home birth care. And you'll find out quite soon that we didn't actually have a home birth, but it was still one of the best decisions that we made. And it really, really transformed my experience of birth, even though we didn't have a home birth. So that's the kind of, I suppose, the context. That's where we're starting from in terms of what we wanted from birth. I really, really wanted a straightforward vaginal birth. I was very scared of having an instrumental birth. I was very scared of having an unplanned cesarean birth. Having sort of seen them, been there, I really was very set in my head about what I wanted to experience. I don't know whether that was helpful to me or not, but that was very much was my mindset going into the birth.
But can I just ask that, just as you're saying that, it makes me think that, when you know someone through Instagram, you think you know them. And I suppose in my head, from birth, you have been like huge advocate of like physiological birth. And but yeah, that's really interesting to when you kind of went into your midwifery training and what you'd kind of experienced to date before you got pregnant. You're then saying that when you were actually pregnant yourself and did that hypnobirthing course, that you had a kind of mindset change?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose an important thing to kind of understand, I guess, about midwifery training is that you don't really see physiological birth. Like on a labour ward, it just doesn't really happen. Or if it does, you have to technically support 40 physiological births to qualify, but it's not in the kind of what you're picturing in kind of a home birth context. That is a baby that comes out of a vagina without assistance in wherever they do it. And I suppose at the beginning, that was what I wanted. And then through the hypnobirthing course, what I understood that I hadn't understood before is what actually makes that happen. And what in a hospital, what the specific, I knew that in a hospital it didn't happen often and that there was lots of intervention, but I wasn't completely clear on why. Particularly the little things that in a hospital seem really normal. You know, women would come in and we would say, okay, can you just hop up on the scales? They're in labour and we're asking to weigh them in case they need anaesthetic in for an emergency cesarean. Like, it's absolute madness. I'm like, when I understood the impact that would have, that very much changed my approach of what I actually kind of wanted from my birth. And so, yeah, I suppose that's where the kind of shift happened. It was the understanding of the tiny little shifts that actually can have big impacts on how birth unfolds.
Yeah, and that's a great message to get out there, isn't it? Because I think our natural assumption would be that the maternity system, you know, knows about all that and is going to be supporting that. And so it's a really important message, A, that they don't, and B, that actually it's not that difficult to understand and look into it. And obviously that's like your motivation in courses like yours. But, you know, I think that just, it's not intuitive, is it, that you would need to do that because you assume that the system's going to be set up for it. So yeah, I think it'd be really interesting for people to hear that someone that was even your journey.
I think you get very used to what you see in a hospital. You know, I wasn't afraid of hospitals, and that was, I think, worked in the end to my benefit. Like, being in hospital I wasn't bothered by that. It was a place I was very familiar with. I wasn't afraid of the actual environment of a hospital, which that in itself can affect people a lot. But that wasn't what specifically was bothering me. It was more, I could see the kind of the attitudes and the little things that happened, to the point that I flat out refused to book at the hospital that I worked at, because I was like, if I end up on the labour ward and this person is there, like, that baby is not coming out because I'm going to cross my legs and not go anywhere near them. So I didn't book at the hospital that I was working at. We booked at our slightly more local hospital. But yeah, those were the sort of shifts, I suppose, that happened for me during pregnancy. So then we got to, where was I? 38 and a bit weeks pregnant. And my baby had stopped moving. And obviously this is something that's kind of reiterated a lot during pregnancy, is to be, from kind of 28 weeks onwards, being aware of how your baby is moving. And for me, there had been, like, even up to this point, a few episodes before this where it just felt like he wasn't moving as much as he normally would. So we had been at a firework party, and the whole time I was just sort of slightly aware. I was like, I just don't think he's moving as much as normal, but maybe it's because I'm busy, maybe it's because I'm distracted. So we went home, and that evening, sort of after this firework thing, I was like, yeah, he still isn't moving. I think we should kind of pop in and get checked. So we went up to the hospital that evening, and they put me on the monitor, and fortunately everything was fine. They did suggest having an induction of labour at this point in time, but at that point I was, very much still in my head, no, I'm having a home birth, he's fine, we're going to go home, we're going to wait for labour. Some conversations were kind of had, and I eventually said, what else can we do? Can I come in tomorrow and can I actually think I said, can I have a scan like now? Because it was evening, nighttime. They couldn't do a scan right now, but they said, we can book you in for a scan tomorrow morning. And for me, that felt like a plan that I was kind of happy with. Coming in for a scan just to kind of confirm that he's growing, that everything is kind of going as expected, felt like something that I was comfortable with. So we did go home, got a good night's sleep, got ready the next morning to go in for this scan. Got to the hospital, had the scan. Everything, like, he was growing normally. It was sort of fine, but he didn't move at all during the scan. And I still hadn't really felt him move. So now we're going on like probably over 12 hours than when I'd felt him kind of move sort of normally. So there wasn't like any urgent, he needs to be born immediately, but there was, because of this still lack of movement, there was still kind of concern as to maybe something wasn't quite right.
And how did you feel? Like, what were your instincts telling you?
At this point, I think there was probably like a niggling doubt, very, very, very deep down, that something maybe wasn't quite right. But I was still very steadfast at this point in my mind that I was going home now and we were waiting for labour and I was having a home birth. Thank you very much. That was still very much, the plan that was in my head. And then sort of in the hours that followed, it just felt like we were kind of passed from person to person, having all these different conversations while people tried to work out what the best thing was for us to do. There was like monitoring and there was meetings and conversations, and it was all just very confusing. I didn't really know what I wanted to do or what the best thing was to do. And then it got to about, so the scan was at like 11 o'clock in the morning, and we were still there at 5 o'clock. So, and nobody had told us that we were now in for the day. So that in itself was also very confusing. We were like, when can we leave this place? When can we go home? But by about 5 o'clock, we found ourselves on the day assessment unit in a cubicle, just monitoring baby's heart rate. I'm pretty sure we were just in there on our own. And we got this little knock sort of on the curtain. And a midwife that we recognised poked her head round, and she was the head of the home birth team. And she had been out all day doing her visits, doing her home birth work. And when she came back to the hospital, she'd seen our names on a board somewhere, so knew that we were in and recognised them as names that were booked under the home birth team. So she said, I just thought I'd pop in and check that everything was okay, at which point I just burst into tears, I think. So she took us into a side room and went and had a conversation and got our notes and kind of got herself up to date with what our current circumstances were. And we just had, it must have been about a 45-minute long conversation where finally somebody was talking to us that understood what I wanted from my birth, what I was, very frankly asked me, what is it that you're worried about? What is it that is scaring you? What is it that's making you say no? What is it that you want? And just had like this really unpushy, balanced, nuanced conversation about all of our options. If we went home and planned for a home birth, what would that look like? What would her concerns be? What would our concerns be? That 45-minute conversation just changed my entire, that is what I attribute the positivity of our entire birth experience down to, was this single conversation where somebody just listened to us and just knew that we were scared and why we were scared, and wasn't thinking, just get on with it, and we eventually in that conversation decided that the right thing to do was to have an induction of labour, but it very much felt like that decision was coming from me. It felt like my decision. It didn't feel like something that I was pushed into, and this is something that I've kind of gone on to communicate as like a really sort of key part of my work with birth ed, is that the difference between an induction, a cesarean, any decision any kind of birth that you have, when it feels like you did it because you chose to do it, that is a very, very different emotional picture to an induction or a cesarean that you had because somebody made you or because you didn't feel like you had any choice. And going into birth feeling like it was something that we chose ended up being, I think, really, really important in terms of the experience that we ended up having. So at the end of this kind of conversation, when we decided that yes, an induction now felt like the right plan, she offered to do a stretch and sweep, which if people aren't familiar with is basically stretching the cervix to hopefully kind of get labour going. And because we had already decided, yes, an induction feels like the right thing to do, that felt like kind of a good starting point to me. And particularly for it to be done by somebody that I felt very comfortable with, very trusting in, all of those things were important in the kind of decision making around that. So we had a stretch and sweep. She's found that my cervix was already kind of stretching, was already starting to open. It's completely irrelevant, and you'll see in the whole story that it's completely irrelevant, but the cervix, if you're interested, was 2 centimetres dilated. The numbers don't mean anything, but it was sort of, I suppose, a good sign that things were definitely moving forwards. The one caveat that I had to accepting the induction was that before we did it, I needed to go home. I needed to get out of this hospital that I'd been in all day. We didn't have any of our stuff for starters. And they were like, just send your husband home and get your stuff. And I was like, no, I know what happens here. Then I end up on an antenatal ward on my own. You end up starting to do things and I don't feel then strong enough or able to ask the questions. I was like, no, I need to get out of this hospital. I need to go home. I need to have a shower. We were washing up in the sink. We need to do the washing up. We need to go buy snacks. I need to just sit down and let this decision settle in me for a bit. So we did that. We left the hospital. We went home. I had a shower, washed my hair. We sort of readdressed the decision to just double check, is this definitely what we wanted to do? And decided, yes, it was. We went to M&S and got snacks. And once we had kind of really decided, yes, this is what we're going to be doing now, that's when we allowed ourselves to get excited. We're going to meet our baby soon. In my head, I was like, in 4 days' time. But it was happening. The labour and the birth was going to be starting. I sat and watched 3 episodes of Friends. So I really got myself into a good headspace before we went back to the hospital. So I think we got home probably at 5:30, 6-ish. And we were back at the hospital about 8:30. Now, when we got there, previously as well, that the midwife, the amazing home birth midwife, had phoned the labour ward just to kind of update them of our situation so that they would be expecting us. Had spoken to them about what we wanted from the birth. I was like, I want to be able to use the pool on the labour ward. I want to be able to kind of move. I don't want to be kind of strapped to a bed. And she had gone and communicated all of that for us, which again made me feel like really reassured. Now, when we got back to the hospital at 8:30, obviously there's a shift change in most hospitals between 7 and 8 p.m. usually. So when we got there, nobody was expecting us. They didn't know who we were. And the hospital had got really busy. So there had been space to start the induction at 5:30 when we'd been having the initial conversations. But during our time having left the hospital, by the time we came back, now all of the labour ward was full and it wasn't there wasn't space even on the antenatal ward to take us in to start the induction. Now, this, I think, in hindsight, actually worked out in our favour because they then didn't want me to go home, but there was no space on the antenatal ward. So the only place that they could put us was in this beautiful birth centre room that was like this private room. It had a couch, it had a bed, it had all this space in it. So this was our new kind of holding zone versus what would have been like a cubicle on an antenatal ward. So we were quite happy with this setup. We were very comfortable. We had some dinner. We watched some telly. And actually, it's a birth centre, so very, very nice. So we felt very relaxed there. However, every hour that we were kind of expecting somebody to come in and be like, okay, we're ready to start, it just wasn't happening. There were no updates. Nobody was coming in. We felt very kind of left on our own. Eventually, about midnight, a doctor finally made their way round to the birth centre to see us. And I think probably what was particularly difficult about this was that all of the conversations that day had been about how important it was that we had the induction and how dangerous it would be to not have the induction. And that I had asked, maybe I could come back in tomorrow morning and we'll do it. And it had been like, no, you have to do it tonight. And then when we got in to do it and they couldn't do it, oh, it was fine. It was totally safe to delay it. It didn't need to be done right now. And so that was very conflicting, that it was okay to delay it when it was on their terms, but to delay it on my terms would have been far too dangerous. So that did make me feel a little bit uneasy and kind of on edge.
And were the movements, did they just sort of continue to be very minimal?
So they were still reduced, and so they weren't. It just didn't feel normal at this point. So I was still very happy with the decision to do the induction. Doctor came in to see us at about midnight, and was like, okay, okay, we can do it. And I was like, we're not starting this at midnight. This is ridiculous. I need to go to sleep now. So had, again, thankfully, a really balanced conversation with her. She didn't push us into anything. She suggested another stretch and sweep, which I also felt like was a good idea at that point. So we did that. And I did say, can I just go home and sleep at home and I'll come back in the morning? But they sort of said, we'd like to monitor the baby at 6 a.m. And if we've got space at that time, we could start then. And so actually, in terms of getting the maximum amount of sleep, it did feel like actually staying in was then the right thing to do. So she did a stretch and sweep, similar sort of discovery to the first one, and then basically left us in what was now our own private room. We both had a bed each to sleep on. It was a good, as hospitals go, it was a very good sort of first night in hospital. So we went to sleep. And then about 3 a.m, I woke up with just really low down period pain. So kind of bottom half of my bump, not coming and going, just a kind of constant ache, cramping ache, basically exactly like period pain. So I got up and went to the loo. And found that my mucus plug, delightful, had come away. So I was like, oh, this is definitely a good sign. Something is definitely happening. So I sort of just hung out in the bathroom for a bit because my husband was asleep in the other room. I think I washed my face, brushed my hair, just chilled out for a bit. And then thought, right, I'm going to go back to sleep. So I went back to the bed, had a bit more of a sleep. They woke us at 6 in the morning to do some further monitoring. Still had these kind of crampy sensations, period pain sensations, not coming and going still, just a kind of constant lower abdominal cramp. At about 7 a.m, a student midwife came in with a cup of tea, which was, again, but I was like, well, I feel like we're at some sort of hotel rather than an NHS hospital. But after we'd had our cup of tea, then they were like, okay, now there's space on the antenatal ward, so you need to get out. So we were turfed out, unfortunately, of the beautiful birth centre room. We were like, can we just do it here? Because this is much nicer. But I think they needed the birth centre room for somebody else. So then we went to the antenatal ward, which is definitely a very different vibe to a birth centre. It was a 5-bedded ward with curtains. Everybody had a bed and a chair, but there wasn't very much space. So they put us again on the monitor to kind of check baby before deciding what kind of method of induction to then use. And when I was on the monitor here, I could see, because I was used to looking at CTG monitoring, and I could see that on the trace it looked like I was having contractions. I definitely couldn't feel contractions, but there was definitely like a really regular pattern of contractions appearing on the monitor. So the midwife came in to check and she said, are you feeling those? And I was like, nope, I'm not feeling anything. And for a small moment I thought perhaps I was magic, and that actually I was going to have one of these like pain-free labours where I didn't even know I was in labour and the baby just pops out. I didn't, but it was encouraging to see actually that was happening, and I wasn't even feeling it. So I was like, something's going on in there, and at the moment I can't feel a thing. So she did, which is part of the induction process, a vaginal examination to feel my cervix, which was still, I think, 2 centimeters dilated. And because I was contracting, in inverted commas, I mean, I wasn't feeling anything, but something was happening. They'd said if I wanted to, I could go to the labour ward and they could break my waters and start the induction in that way. Now, there are several steps to the induction process. The kind of stretch and sweep is the very, very bottom one. Then sort of ripening the cervix is the next one up, and then breaking your waters is the one after that. And I was very wary of induction, and I was very, very wary of jumping ahead. I didn't want to break my waters and then nothing happen, and then the only option be the bit of the induction, the hormone drip, the bit that I really wasn't wanting to experience. So I was very keen to take things like really slowly and give my body like a good chance, good opportunity to like catch up, I suppose. So I said, no, I'd much rather do, and at the hospital at the time, the only method that they used for ripening the cervix was a pessary, which is like hormones that go behind the cervix to sort of soften it, hopefully cause it to start to open. And sometimes that triggers labour. So that's where we started. That's what I felt comfortable with. So she put the pessary in, and once that was in and we'd kind of been monitored, I said, can we go for a walk? I'm not sitting in this antenatal ward waiting for labour to start all day. And they were like, yeah, that's a great idea. You can, go for a walk around the car park, or you can go to the canteen. So naturally, we left the hospital completely, walked into Kingston and went for lunch. So we did not stay walking around the hospital, which would have been a horrible thing to do. But within like a 15-minute walk, we found like a beautiful Italian deli where we went for lunch, which was really nice. It was sort of very, very exciting. Like things were going to get started, our baby was going to be here. And I thought, there's no harm in, I've got several days ahead of me. There's no harm in carb loading with a nice bowl of pasta before we get going. So we'd ordered our pasta, we're sitting at our table. And before the pasta arrived, I just stood up and I was like, look, we're going to have to get this pasta to go, because I couldn't sit down. The sensation of that like lower abdominal kind of cramping had disappeared, and now it was like the most intense ache, if you can like imagine inside your body where your cervix is, like deep inside your body. From there, like this radiating deep ache that just meant I literally could not sit on my bum. I was like, oh my god, we need to go, and we need to get this pasta and take it with us. So we got our takeaway pasta. Now it's funny how like, I don't know if it's time or if it's labour, but something definitely blurs your memory. And I can't remember for the life of me if I ever ate this bowl of pasta. But there was pasta at some point, and it came with us in some sort of one of those metal tin things.
I bet your husband ate both bowls.
Yeah, he probably ate both, didn't he? I have to ask him, whatever happened to that pasta that I got 6 years ago, and I don't know if I ate it or not. But we started walking back to the hospital, and on that walk, my contractions started coming, at which point I totally panicked because they were really quite intense quite quickly. And I was like, oh my God, what if this baby comes on the pavement? We've left the hospital. Obviously, don't worry, the baby was not then born on the pavement. He didn't come for several hours yet. But we made it back to the hospital, having not given birth on the pavement. Definitely, like really the contractions were feeling quite intense throughout my bump, like really almost at the kind of cramping sensation that you get in your leg if you get a cramp. That throughout my entire bump, I would describe as the sensation that I was feeling now. And so we got the midwife to help us put the TENS machine on, which I love. I would literally take out shares in a TENS machine. In both of my labours, they have been like my absolute go-to for pain relief. So the TENS machine was on. Then we went back out. We just went to the stairs of the maternity unit this time. And I was like pacing the stairs, going up and down. Again, by this point, like my knowledge of time has now gone out the window. So I was definitely like in what I describe as the underwater part of labour. I was not really aware of the kind of the outside world. Time had become abstract. So from this point, you'll just have to let me guess what sort of timing we were on. But at some point, after probably an hour or so of walking up and down these stairs, I suddenly was like, no, I need to sit down. I was not comfortable standing anymore and I needed to sit down. So we went back to the antenatal ward, and from somewhere got a birth ball, which I sat on next to the bed, kind of leaning over the bed. I feel like they might have put the monitors back on me at some point here, but I was definitely comfortable with the TENS machine on, eyes closed, kind of head over, leaning over the bed, sitting on this ball. And at some point, I got gas and air. I don't remember when, but it was probably around this point. And I remember my husband reading these. So with hypnobirthing, you get like guided relaxations, which are kind of like scripts that you can read that aid like deep relaxation. You can get them as MP3s, or you can read them yourself. And the course that we had done, I really despised the voice of the woman that read their MP3. So I was like, I cannot listen to her. She sounded like the Queen. And I was like, I don't want the Queen to be talking to me while I'm in labour. So I got my husband to record them, which I really liked during pregnancy. But in labour, he was reading them to me in my ear. And because I had gas and air, all I could think in my head, I was like, oh my God, he has no idea how stupid he sounds. This is absolutely hilarious. I thought the whole thing was hilarious. It was definitely the gas and air talking, which is basically laughing gas. But fine, even though I was finding it amusing, that is good for oxytocin. But I didn't actually voice this to him at the time, but I did think he sounded a bit stupid. So that was nice for a while, kept me distracted and entertained. And then eventually I put in headphones and had like relaxing music that had like nature sounds in the background. So I think it was like a lot of rain music. And that was really good at just like taking me out of this antenatal ward environment, helping me relax. In my head, I was in Esher Woods, which are like the woods near our house, in the pouring rain. And the kind of visualization practice, hypnobirthing practice that we'd done in pregnancy, I was able to kind of access that just through the music and the sounds rather than actually using any of the guided relaxations in labour. And this and the TENS machine and the breathing and the gas and air, that little combo was very, very helpful for like the vast majority of labour. I then got to a point where I was like, I'm now not comfortable sitting down. And I remember just moving and like desperately trying to find anywhere that felt vaguely comfortable and finding it really difficult to get into any position that was like vaguely comfortable. And I eventually found myself laying on the bed. If you can picture this, so you've got a hospital bed with the back propped up. Imagine if your head is like down where your feet would usually be, and my feet were propped up at the top of the bed. Like basically I was in like some sort of shoulder stand. This was the only position that was like vaguely comfortable to me in labour. And this is one of the things that I was really grateful that we didn't have like one-to-one midwife support at this point, because there is nothing about the position that I was in that is listed on any like antenatal course. If you ever look up birth positions, I promise you that you will not find one with a shoulder stand in it. But for some reason, this is the position that was comfortable to me. And in hindsight, I can look back, and I know that my baby had been back to back in the kind of early part of labour. And in hindsight, looking back at it, I know that this was my body telling me to basically tip him back out of the pelvis so that he could turn around and get back in the way that he needed to. And so it was amazing that I was able to, nobody ever even really saw me do it. So I was never kind of guided out of it. I did also feel at this point like a pushy sensation. And this was a very, very different sensation to like bearing down to push. It was like a kind of nudging sensation. And I said to my husband to tell the midwife that it felt like I needed to push. And so that they came in, and the first midwife, who was lovely, I think she was either Scottish or Irish, but she was very kind, very friendly. And so she suggested a vaginal examination, which she did. And at this point, she said she thought it was 4 centimetres, which I knew meant, in inverted commas, established labour, now you can have your own room. But she just needed to go and get her like midwife in charge to go and check. And I was so out of it at this point. You know, I hear this now, me saying it, and I'm like, what on earth are you talking about? She needed somebody to go and check. Of course, you can't repeat it. Like, you do it once and that's the answer. But when I was in it, when you're in that stage of labour, you basically will just say yes to anything. So this other midwife, who was not friendly, repeated it. And she said, no, you're only 3 centimetres dilated. So you definitely don't need to push. And when I had now have the full picture of what was going on, I now know that the rest of the labour ward was full. So I know that there wasn't a room for me. So I know that it would have been very inconvenient for them to have found that I was 4 centimetres dilated and that I needed a room. I personally would, looking back and kind of reflecting on it, would much rather have them said, yeah, you are, but there's not a room. So as soon as there is one, you can have it. But that's not what they said. They basically told me that I wasn't in labour. And fortunately, when I had been doing my midwifery training, I had worked with a midwife who was very, very experienced birth centre midwife. And we had seen somebody in a similar situation to the one that I was in now, where it looked like she was in inverted commas early labour, but she had a pushing sensation. And this midwife had said to me, she didn't talk to the woman at all, she just let her get on with it. And she said, just look at what she's doing. And I was like, well, it looks like she's pushing. She was like, yeah, she is. But it's not pushing like bearing down, expulsive, get a baby out pushing. She's like, her baby's back to back. Just watch. And within 10, 15 minutes, she'd stop doing it. The little pushing that she was doing. She'd stop doing it. And then within 2 hours, her baby was born. And this sensation that she'd been feeling was her body just correcting a difficult position for her baby. So I'm so glad that I had that experience and that I'd seen that happen, because then in my head, in my own birth, rather than resisting what my body was telling me to do, I was able to just kind of channel this incredible midwife. And I think in my head, I said, well, fuck you. I'm just listening to what my body's telling me to do, and it's telling me to push. So that's what I'm going to do. And so I did. And then during that time, so I still had the pessary in at this point in time. So this was probably, I don't know, 5, 6 o'clock in the evening now. And I still had the pessary in. And something that can happen when you've got a pessary or hormone part of ripening the cervix is that if that kickstarts labour, you can do something called hyperstimulate, which is when your contractions, rather than having a contraction and then having like a nice break in between that helps you actually kind of relax, that helps the placenta fill back up with blood, that helps the uterus do its job, you don't get the gap in between. So I was now having contraction after contraction after contraction without any breaks in between, which is so unbelievably impossible to manage. So at this point I was like, right, I need anything. I need an epidural, I need a pool, I need my own room. I literally do not care what it is, but you have to get me something. Obviously there wasn't a room, let alone a room with a pool in it, which meant I also couldn't have an epidural. So somebody managed to talk me into having pethidine. I would have taken anything. If you'd told me that putting a sock on my head would have fixed it at this point in time, honestly, I would have done anything. And I also remember saying to the midwife, you take this pessary out or I'm pulling it out myself, because I knew that the way of fixing it was to remove it. So they took it out and really just kept stalling the giving me of this pethidine. Oh, you need to be monitored for half an hour, but they didn't go and get the monitors, all kinds of reasons why they weren't giving it to me. Then the shift changeover happened again, which is the kind of 7 to 8 o'clock thing. And a new midwife came on who fortunately was much nicer than the one who had been on before. And basically gave me pethidine straight away, because I was now desperate for it. I was asking for it. So she gave me this pethidine. And then very, very shortly after that, a room on the labour ward became available. And I remember they came in with a wheelchair and they were like, just get on the wheelchair and we'll take you to the room. I remember looking at this person with a wheelchair and I was like, you're not going to get me there quickly. You're going to take me really like gently to this room. And here in my hand, I have gas and air. And in that room over there is gas and air. And on this journey, there is not going to be gas and air. And I remember I'd been to the toilet earlier in labour and I'd said this gas and air does absolutely nothing. So I went for a wee, sat down on the toilet and had a contraction without gas and air. And I was like, oh my God, it does. I need it back. So I was like, I am not having a contraction in this corridor because you're pushing this wheelchair too slowly. So I was like, right, tell me which room it is and I'm going to go there between contractions. So they pointed at this room and I have no idea what came over me, but I took the gas and air from the antenatal ward, took my like last gasp of it and then sprinted, like ran down the corridor in labour into this next room just to like get hold of the gas and air, which obviously wasn't like ready and waiting for me. But eventually got that. So now we were in a labour ward room. I was standing up, had the gas and air, fine. Just sort of getting myself used to the new space. I'd had my eyes closed. I didn't even see this room until the baby was born. And so like I definitely had pictures in my head of I wanted like the lights to be dimmed. I wanted to create like a space once we were on the labour ward. Now, once they got there, I was in such the deep throes of labour that I didn't even open my eyes. I could have still been in the corridor and I actually wouldn't have noticed. But at this point, I still now wanted an epidural. I just wanted something that was going to help me. So before having the epidural, the new midwife, or another midwife now, said, okay, we'll do a vaginal examination before having the epidural so we can kind of see what's going on. And I was like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, because actually, if I'm like nearly there, maybe I don't need it. So I had this vaginal examination. And so bearing in mind a minute ago, well, maybe like an hour ago, I was 3 centimetres dilated. Had this vaginal examination. She was like, oh, you're 8 centimetres dilated. And for me, that was, and I know the numbers mean absolutely nothing. And if she'd never told me I was 3 centimetres, I never would have doubted myself. But that was the confirmation that I needed to go, actually, I was right. I think I remember saying, I told you I was in labour and nobody believed me. And that was what I needed to know, that I knew what was going on better than anybody else did. So I then decided I didn't want the epidural. I wanted you all to just leave me alone and let me get on with it. So then I spent some time, I was now on the bed, but I remember being like up on, almost like kneeling upright, leaning over the back of the bed, and then finding it comfortable kind of like resting on my side. And very, very shortly after that, I got the urge to push, a very different urge to the sensation that I'd been feeling before, like a kind of expulsive, the baby is coming, kind of pushing. And this surprised me that in comparison to what I'd been feeling before, this was like easy. It was like it felt really good. It felt like, the best way that I can describe it is if you've ever stubbed your toe and you get a really sore toe, you know, when you squeeze it and squeezing it makes it feel better. That in my first labour is what the pushing sensation felt like. It was like something was hurting, but I could do something that almost stopped it, that like stemmed it, that made it feel better. And so suddenly going from essentially that first part of labour, I felt quite passive, like it was happening within my body and there was nothing that I could do about it, into this part of labour where I felt like an active participant, like everything that I was doing was actually progressing labour and I was doing something. And I found that really, really good and really helpful and a really useful thing to be able to kind of cling on to in labour. So definitely that was definitely helpful and surprised me, because I thought this would be the hard part of labour, and then in that labour it was actually the easier part of labour. And then as he was being born, I don't know, probably like half an hour into pushing, I remember this, it was like an abstract voice, because I still hadn't opened my eyes to even see what this midwife looked like, to even see who she was. And she was good, at least, like she hadn't interfered up to this point. She wasn't bothering me. She had very much kind of left me to it. My mum and my husband were there and they both said that she basically just sort of hid in the corner, which was good because that's what I wanted. And then I was on the monitors at this point. They were listening into baby's heart rate, and I remember her saying from the side of the room, "Oh, baby's heart rate's dropping. I'm just going to get somebody to come in to see if you need a bit of help." And those were the words that she said. Now, having worked on a labour, that sounds fine. That sounds like a totally fine thing to suggest. Having worked on a labour ward, I immediately in my head, I was like, well, I know that that's code for instrumental birth. And in my head, vividly remember saying, like, fuck, you are helping me. And I remember that I had been pushing, but I wasn't like, I was pushing with my body rather than pushing with all my might. And the suggestion of this was, okay, well, I'm just going to push with all my might and get him out before you can actually come near me with anything. And within 3 pushes after her saying that, he was born. He was born with his hand up on his face, which is why the kind of progress, it wasn't even slow progress, but I think that was why the concern had kind of arisen, was because his little hand was up. But fortunately then he came out, and the paediatrician walked in the room and heard a baby crying and was like, oh, okay, well, bye, and then walked back out again. So we didn't have, I don't think we had like a room filling with people. I think maybe like 1 or 2 people kind of strolled in and then realised that it was all fine and then actually left. And then he went straight up to my chest and was kind of skin to skin with me, which is what I'd asked for, but I actually, in hindsight, I'm like, oh, I wish we'd all just taken a moment to like see him, because he was just plonked right up by my face and I just couldn't see him. And I was like, oh, I don't know who, I remember saying, I don't know who you are. Hello, I don't know who you are, because I just couldn't see him. And I wish it had just been like, okay, there he is. And then I had been kind of allowed to receive him rather than somebody had just plonked him on me. And then I remember that she had kind of asked consent to give the injection for the placenta whilst I was pushing, which is the most ridiculous thing in the entire world, because right then you could have asked me for £1 million and I would have given you £1 million. I didn't have the capacity to consent or not consent to anything. So I remember, I think I said yes, but you know, I don't think it was particularly informed consent. So that all just kind of happened in a blur. The injection happened, she pulled the placenta out and then it was gone. And I remember about half an hour after he was born being like, oh, can I have a look at the placenta? And she was like, oh no, it's gone. It's gone. Which then very much played a part into my second birth. I was very explicit about what happened to the placenta. I was like, you are not cutting any kind of cord until they are both out. And I've seen them and I've seen them attached. And so that went, and that was a bit disappointing in hindsight. But in the moment when he was born, I just felt like overwhelming pride, not at him, but at myself, at like what I had just done. The fact that they had been constantly trying to interfere and I had done it on my own. I just was like, so proud of myself, and I felt so good. And it wasn't like an instant rush overwhelming love with the baby. I wasn't like indifferent to him, I liked him, but it wasn't like an overwhelming, oh my god, here you are, I've been waiting for you all this time. It was very surprised, like, oh wow, hello, who are you? I don't know who you are, you don't look like what I expected you to look like. All of that just felt like a big kind of surprise. But it was, the feeling that I had was just like total awe of what it felt like, what I'd managed, how difficult it had been, but how I'd still done it. So it was overwhelmingly positive. And for months after that, I was just walking on air with like, I remember coming out of the hospital being like, you don't, to all the people walking down the street, just thinking like, you don't know what I've just done. Like, I just had a baby and like, you're just going about your life and you've got no idea. And so there are certainly things that I look back knowing what I know now, doing the work that I do now, having had another birth, and looking back going like, oh, I might have done that a little bit differently, or it was really bad that they behaved in this way, or that they said this. But in the moment, and for the months and even years afterwards, I just thought it was incredible. And I was so happy with how it had gone. And I think that was my kind of main takeaway, and the main kind of message that I would pass on is that even when things don't go the way that you wanted them to, or the way that you had expected them to, that your strength and your ability to do it doesn't lie in your home or a birth pool or whatever it is that you've kind of attached to the experience that you want. It's in yourself, and that comes with, it's in you and it's in your baby and the connection that you have together, and that goes with you wherever and however you are giving birth to your baby. And that the mental preparation that I did for a home birth really, really helped, because I could keep saying to myself, well, if I was at home, I wouldn't have this. If I was at home, I wouldn't be able to do this. And that, from a kind of managing it mentally perspective, really helped. But actually proving to myself that it was me that did it. It wasn't home that did it. It wasn't, a birth pool that did it. It was the strength that kind of we had. I think that was my kind of main takeaway, and something that just totally went on to shape me, like as a mother, in my business, in everything that I did kind of moving forwards.
Thank you. And that's, I'm sure that's your motivation, but it's mine too. It's just that more women would come through birth feeling like that. That's very much how I felt when I had my second baby. It's just, I could do anything if I can do that. And sadly, it's not as common an experience as it should be, isn't it? Because it is absolutely true. Do you mind if I just pick up on a couple bits?
No, of course, yeah.
I was wondering what kind of tips you have. I was really interested when you were talking about that conversation you had with the midwife when you kind of decided to have the induction, and you mentioned the word nuance. And I think me personally, with my first baby, that's what I really struggled to find was nuance. So I had gestational diabetes, and they wanted to induce me because they were worried the baby would get stuck. But then I was like, but induction can also increase the risk of, shoulder dystocia. So where's the nuance? I found no nuance. And that made it hard for me to trust. And I suspect that isn't an uncommon experience. So yeah, how do you find the nuance in the system?
It's difficult, isn't it? And I think ultimately it doesn't lie with you, it lies with who you're speaking to and their ability to understand nuance. When I was applied for midwifery, most midwifery degrees are a Bachelor of Science degree, but there's one in the UK, and I'm not sure which hospital, which university it is, but theirs is a BA, so a Bachelor of Arts. And it just triggered a really interesting conversation for me in the kind of the question of, is midwifery a science or is it an art? And I think there's an art to midwifery, and I think some midwives are very, very good at understanding what that is. And so I think sometimes when you are very, very used to working in a hospital, whether that is as a doctor or a midwife, if you're very used to working in the kind of the medicalized system, it's very simple to just look at things in like black and white terms, to look at numbers, to look at data. And it becomes difficult to look at a whole person and to kind of understand that they are coming at it with their own experiences, with their own wishes, with their own desires, with their own background, with their own culture. There's so much that's going to impact their decision that isn't just the data. And equally, there's so much that influences the data that we're relying on that is actually influenced by their culture and their decisions and the people that decided to partake in the research in the first place. And so it's never black and white. And I think from a kind of going into your own birth perspective, if you can just acknowledge that data is never in maternity and most healthcare black and white, it's always influenced by the person that's decided to do the research, by the people that have decided to partake in the research. So it can never be taken as a kind of yes or no decision. So just understanding that so that you can kind of start to ask the questions. And then it is kind of relying on the person that you're then having the conversation with. If they're a good midwife or a good doctor, then just being really human with them and just saying, like, this is what I'm scared of, this is what I wanted, this is what I think it might turn out like, can, I think, make them realise what it is that's influencing your decision, and sometimes can kind of soften them to have a more humanized conversation. And sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes they go, well, I don't know what you're scared of. Why you're scared of that? You're going to be fine. Or, well, it might happen, but so what? And if you're getting that kind of response, I would just stop the conversation and have it with somebody else. just say, I don't know if I'm going to be able to come to a decision in this conversation. Is there somebody else that I can speak to? And if that's the decision that you're making in pregnancy, somebody like a consultant midwife, or asking your midwife which doctor might be a good person to have that kind of conversation with, would be a kind of really helpful thing to do. If it's actually you're in labour and you're there, it might just be like grabbing a different midwife or going to the desk and seeing if there is somebody else that you can speak to, because there's always a second opinion that you can ask for. And so it might just be a case of kind of choosing who you have that conversation with.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And a bit more along the nuanced lines, but how easy was it? So I was really interested when you said that they could have broken your waters, but you wanted to almost start a step back in the induction process. And my hunch is that for a lot of women, perhaps that wouldn't be, well, it probably wasn't even presented to you as a choice. I don't know if it was. Was it just your knowledge that meant you could make that decision to have the pessary instead, or was it offered to you as a genuine choice?
I think it was. I think both were offered, actually. I do. But it was the lovely Irish or maybe Scottish midwife that I was having that conversation with. And she had a home birth. And so we'd already had lots of conversations leading up to this moment about what I had wanted. So we were lucky that she was very much understanding of my kind of approach. But also I did very much know what the induction process was, just through having been a student midwife at the time. So in part, it was probably that, but I do know that often it isn't presented as a choice. It's, oh, look, we can break your waters, so we'll just wait for you to go to the labour ward. So yeah, knowing that you can go, well, what else could I do? If I didn't do that, what would my other options be? Is a really always helpful question to ask, I think.
And when did your waters go in the process?
Oh, in the pushing stage. So literally, yeah, just before he was born.
Yeah, and actually, I bet you were glad to have them intact, because we know that there's real benefits to that, don't we, to the baby in the process. So actually, yeah, it made a big difference.
Particularly because he was likely, I think, in a difficult position in that early part of labour. And what can happen when we break the waters is it can move baby down into the pelvis more deeply. And if he wasn't aligned yet, it could have been that, yeah, we moved him in too quickly, he was malpositioned, and either he wouldn't come out or he might have needed help getting out. So yeah, absolutely. In hindsight, I'm really glad that we were able to kind of take it slowly.
And final, just pick your brains whilst I've got a chance. But it is, as I've started to gather stories for this podcast, it is difficult to find positive induction stories, and kind of from your viewpoint, based from your own experience, but also, more widely, why is that? It's a bit how long is a piece of string, but I suspect you'll have some ideas of common themes.
What as to why induction is often not positive? Yeah. So, I mean, I think it starts at the decision-making process. I think the main contributor to a lot of trauma that is caused by induction is misinformation, and the fact that a lot of women go into it without realizing that they even had a choice. And as I kind of sort of spoke about in my own experience, the way that choosing versus not choosing something that happens impacts the way that we experience something emotionally, is really, really important. And I think a lot of women are just told, okay, well, we've booked you in for an induction on this day, and they never had a conversation about it. They never knew that they could turn it down. They never knew that actually the research around the reason for them needing or being suggested an induction, they never knew that actually the chances of something bad happening were so small or so tiny. And they look back and they go, oh, if I'd known that, I might have made a different decision. So there's definitely that. And I think that's a huge contributor. So definitely making sure that you know it's a choice and that you understand like the politics around induction, if that makes sense. So we're seeing in the UK at the moment, every single year, the induction rate doesn't even creep up, it jumps up higher and higher and higher. I think the last statistics we've got are the 2021s, and it was over 50% of women are either having a planned cesarean birth or an induction of labour. So less than half of women are going into spontaneous labour, which if that was genuinely needed, the human race would have been wiped out by now. If less than half of the human race could go into labour spontaneously and have a baby at the end of it, then the maths just doesn't make sense. We would have died out. So there is no way that the induction rates need to be as high as they are. There absolutely is space for induction as a potentially life-saving intervention for some women. And it's about asking the right questions to work out, am I one of the women or one of the people that genuinely need an induction of labour for the safety of myself or my baby? Or have I just ticked the wrong box somewhere on a bit of paper and this is where I've ended up? And it's your decision to make, and it's not somebody else's decision to kind of put upon you. So that would be my kind of first tip. The second thing is, again, just like the understaffing and the system of a hospital, is that the expectation of what an induction is going to be, you're going to go in and you're going to have your baby now, is sort of what women are sold, and they aren't adequately counselled on the fact that the induction story I've just told for a first-time mum at 39 weeks is really fast. Like, that is an incredibly quick induction for a first-time mum of that gestation. You're mainly looking at 3 or 4 days on an antenatal ward before you're even in labour. And that might be that it's the process taking time to work, but it might be that there's no room on the labour ward, or somebody's come in that needs an induction more urgently than you do. And there's these kind of constant delays. And I think the lack of honesty around what that might look like sets people up for an experience that they weren't expecting. And we don't like things that we weren't expecting. We don't like to be deceived. And that, again, sets us up emotionally for a bad time. And then the final thing would just be that the induction process generally does carry more risks than a spontaneous labour. So the risk of your baby's heart rate dropping and somebody needing to intervene is higher when you're inducing labour. The risk of an instrumental birth is higher when you have an induction of labour. The risk of an unplanned caesarean birth is higher when you have an induction of labour. And those things in themselves, any intervention or complexity of labour is going to impact your experience of it, particularly if that is different to what you had kind of hoped for or wanted. So I would say it's a very, very complex combination of all of those things, but that's quite a lot of potential places to trip up. And some of those things are in our control, and we can ask the right questions and make the right decisions, and we can kind of counteract them. But some of them aren't within our control. If an induction is the right decision, some of those things still aren't within our control. We can do lots to support our physiology. We can do lots to support our movement, to support what we're feeling. But some of that will be taken out of our hands just by the fact that we have had the intervention, even if it was a justified intervention.
Yeah, no, but that's really helpful. And I think it was really helpful how you described how you got to your decision. And I think, as you say, that step is often missing.
In my experience, that is the most of any kind of birth, that is the most important thing. It doesn't matter. I mean, it does matter, but it doesn't actually matter in terms of how you feel about your experience. We know that there isn't necessarily a link between the outcome of a birth and trauma. Over half of trauma is caused by the care that people are receiving, and it's not necessarily a physical thing that happened, like an event that happened, or somebody being very unwell. It is somebody didn't listen to me, somebody pushed me into something, I felt coerced. It's that causes trauma, and that is just so easily overcome by healthcare professionals doing their job in a good way. And sometimes we can do it for ourselves as women going into it, asking the right questions, making sure we're speaking to the right people. But again, ultimately, that responsibility shouldn't be ours to shoulder. It should just be forthcoming. But when it's not, it might be that we have some control over who we're speaking to and the questions that we're asking. And we should take every bit of control that we have, we should kind of take hold of and utilize. And so then if it is in our control, we can do something about it. But as I said, it's not always preventable.
No, definitely. And I guess that's why often people who work in the birth world end up, I know you do, and I'm a bit like this, is you sort of wear 2 hats and you get involved in stuff where you hope to change the wider system, but you also want to help women and families right now who are having their babies, and equip them, like you say, with all the bits that you can control, which I think is a lot more than people sometimes realize, just to be equipped for what things are like at the moment. And I know that you do amazing work in both those spheres, so thank you so much, and thank you for telling your story. Have you got 6? Is he at school at the moment?
Yeah, he's at school now. We did birthday presents this morning. I made Pizza Express after school and watching Strictly with hot chocolates this evening. So that's how we saved Strictly from last weekend. So that's our 6th birthday plans. Low key, but it should be nice.
Yeah, it sounds brilliant. And thank you so much for taking the time to share his birth story with us.
Thank you. Oh, it was really nice to say it all on his actual birthday. So I'm glad the timing worked out like this.
It's brilliant. Thank you so much, Megan.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. This podcast does not present itself as medical advice, and neither should it be taken as such. The views represented here are personal to the women telling their stories. Sorry for this slightly patronising disclaimer, but such is the world we live in today. Always seek out the information you need before making your own decisions.